The night was still, but a tension lingered in the air of the London townhouse. The clock struck midnight, its deep chimes echoing through the marble halls as if announcing the arrival of something far more sinister than the hour. Detective Lord Peter Wimsey arrived at the scene, stepping cautiously across the threshold of the estate with a quiet, measured gait. The case was far from ordinary. In fact, it was the sort of case that seemed absurd in its very premise. A crime had occurred. In the library, a room locked from the inside, and the only clue was a page of handwritten notes, stained with ink. It wasn't even clear whether the notes were relevant. A rather curious clue, to say the least. The victim, one Reginald Fenwick, was a well-known scholar of ancient texts, a man who would be at ease in a labyrinth of codes and riddles. Yet this was a puzzle that made no sense at all. The police had already arrived, but they were stumped. Inspector Kingsley stood by the door, nervously wringing his hands. "The room was locked, as you can see," he said, gesturing toward the thick wooden door with its single brass handle. Fenwick was alone. The servants heard nothing. And then they found him slumped over the desk. No signs of forced entry, no weapon, no struggle. And yet, he's dead. Wimsey looked around the room carefully. The library, with its oak bookshelves and elegant leather-bound volumes, had always felt like a sanctuary for those who wanted peace and quiet. It was a room designed for thought, not for violence. The desk at the far end of the room, neatly organized with papers, had been untouched, save for the peculiar page of ink-stained notes lying in front of the deceased. "Have you touched the page?" Wimsey asked calmly. Kingsley shook his head. "We didn't want to disturb anything. It's all rather strange, you see. There's no sign of any struggle, and yet Fenwick appears to have been poisoned, though there's no poison we've been able to find." Wimsey walked over to the desk and picked up the page, turning it over in his gloved hands. The writing was elegant, neat, and clearly from someone well-versed in literature. But the content, it was an enigma, just a series of cryptic lines, as though a message had been hidden within a jumble of seemingly random words. To decipher this, one must know the art of illusion. Wimsey murmured aloud, mostly to himself. Kingsley raised an eyebrow. "An art of illusion. I thought you were here to solve a murder, not ponder riddles." Wimsey's lips curled into a faint smile. "The two are often intertwined, Inspector." His eyes flicked toward the closed windows. They, too, had been locked from the inside, with no sign of any break-in. And yet, something felt wrong. The page, which had been marked with dark ink stains in several places, had left him with an odd feeling that this was not an accidental clue. It was as if it had been placed deliberately, to send a message to someone, or perhaps to him. "Who discovered the body?" Wimsey asked, still absorbed in thought. "Miss Eleanor Fenwick." Kingsley replied. "She's his niece. Found him early this morning, slumped over, as if he'd been working late into the night. At first, she thought he had fallen asleep, but then she noticed the page and the other servants." Wimsey asked, his eyes narrowing. "What did they hear?" Kingsley shook his head. "Nothing unusual. The house is usually quiet at night, and the staff were all accounted for, each in their rooms. There's no sign of anyone entering or leaving. It's as if the man simply dropped dead. A bizarre thing, really." Wimsey frowned as he took in the room once more, noting every detail: the empty decanter of brandy on a side table, the comfortable armchair pulled up close to the fire, and the polished floors reflecting the faint light of the candle sconces. Nothing seemed out of place, and yet everything felt wrong. The page seemed to mock him with its simplicity, its elegance. It was as though the murderer had left behind an abstract riddle, a test meant for someone sharp enough to unravel its true meaning. He turned his attention back to the desk, searching for something, anything that could offer further explanation. And then he saw it. Beneath the ink-stained paper, there was a faint, barely visible mark, a small indentation that was barely perceptible to the eye but unmistakable once you knew to look for it. A fingerprint. No, it didn't match the ones found earlier. Something far subtler, more deliberate. Wimsey placed the page back down and examined the desk more closely. It was then that the peculiar nature of the room struck him. It wasn't simply the locked door or the lack of a struggle. It was the complete absence of any meaningful clue in a murder investigation. One would expect the victim to have left behind some sign of struggle, a mark, a smudge, anything. And yet, there was nothing. Reginald Fenwick had died in what appeared to be an utterly mundane, ordinary setting. Have the servants been questioned thoroughly? Wimsey asked, his voice cutting through the stillness. Kingsley nodded. Yes, but they are all quite adamant that they heard nothing. Miss Fenwick herself claims she was asleep until she woke to check on her uncle this morning. She's utterly shaken, of course, the poor girl. She insists that there was no sound, no noise, from the study, but then again, she is his closest relative. She might be hiding something. Wimsey rubbed his chin thoughtfully. Perhaps the key to this mystery lies not in what we can see, but in what is missing. The absence of anything that's out of place is, itself, a clue. Kingsley looked at him, baffled. What do you mean? I mean, Wimsey replied, that the murder appears too simple, almost too clean, as if someone has gone out of their way to make it seem as though there was nothing to see here. But there's one thing they didn't account for, one thing they overlooked. He turned to face Kingsley, a glimmer of insight lighting his eyes. The page, the ink-stained alibi, is not a clue in the traditional sense. It's a misdirection. And the real story isn't about the victim at all. It's about who planted that false trail. The detective paused for a moment, letting the weight of his words sink in. I believe we are dealing with a far more complicated conspiracy than a simple murder, and our best chance at solving it will be to follow the paper trail, not the one that's stained, but the one that's still waiting to be uncovered. As the quiet murmur of the police continued around him, Wimsey's gaze never wavered from the desk. He had already begun piecing together a mental map of the crime scene, but the puzzle wasn't yet complete. The room was a portrait of stillness, its very ordinariness unnerving. A well-kept library, adorned with books on history and philosophy. Nothing about it screamed danger, and yet the air felt heavy with the residue of something unsaid, something lurking just out of view. He noticed Kingsley still standing by the door, his eyes darting nervously to the officers who were slowly scanning the rest of the house. Wimsey couldn't help but wonder if Kingsley was simply overwhelmed by the strangeness of the case. The inspector seemed to have no more ideas beyond the obvious: the locked door, the lack of evidence, the victim's seemingly peaceful demise. Wimsey, Kingsley said, breaking the silence, I'm afraid we don't have much more to go on. I think you've seen everything we have. What now? Wimsey's eyes flicked to the room again, but instead of responding immediately, he moved toward a small chair by the window. He ran his hand along the armrest, letting his fingers trace the polished wood. The chair seemed perfectly ordinary, yet there was something unsettling about the way it sat, positioned just far enough from the firelight to cast its shadow in a way that seemed deliberate. A small detail, perhaps, but Wimsey couldn't shake the feeling that it had been placed with a specific intention. He sat down, folding his hands together. Has anyone questioned Miss Fenwick thoroughly? He asked, his voice smooth but purposeful. Kingsley hesitated. Well, yes, we've asked her everything we could. She was in her room until the morning. She says she was asleep. No one heard a thing. Where is she now? In the sitting room, trying to compose herself. Wimsey rose from the chair, his sharp eyes catching the flicker of something in the corner of the room. It was a small object, hardly noticeable at first, but something about it didn't sit right. There, by the far corner of the desk, wedged beneath a book, was a tarnished silver pocket watch, its hands frozen at 11:47. Wimsey moved swiftly, lifting the watch gently and inspecting it. It was an old piece, well made, but it wasn't the kind of thing one would casually leave lying about. It seemed out of place. Who does this belong to? Wimsey asked, turning to Kingsley. Kingsley stepped over and examined the watch with a furrowed brow. Not Fenwick's, I'm certain. It doesn't match his style at all. He was never one for such trinkets. Wimsey nodded, feeling the faintest ripple of excitement. A misplaced item, small but crucial. No, it's not his. This belonged to someone else, someone who had been here recently, someone who might not have been entirely honest. Kingsley frowned, but before he could respond, Wimsey's sharp eyes caught another detail: the faintest trace of powder along the edge of the desk, where it met the wood. It was almost imperceptible, the kind of residue one might miss if they weren't looking closely enough. He crouched down, his gloved fingers brushing over the surface. "What is it, Whimsy?" Kingsley asked, growing more anxious. "Not what, but who," Whimsy murmured. "Someone touched this desk recently, and if my suspicions are correct, they were trying to leave something behind. Or, perhaps, conceal something." He stood and turned back to Kingsley. "The watch, the powder. And now this, it's clear we have a deception on our hands. Someone is hiding something, and I think I know just who." With deliberate steps, Whimsy moved toward the sitting room, where Miss Eleanor Fenwick sat quietly, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She was a delicate woman, with pale skin and dark eyes, her face framed by a cascade of soft brown hair. Her composure was flawless to flawless, perhaps. There was something in the way she sat, perfectly still, as though waiting for the inevitable. It was the sort of stillness that seemed unnatural, almost rehearsed. "Miss Fenwick," Whimsy said, softly as he approached. Her eyes lifted to meet his, but they lacked the rawness of someone who had just lost a loved one. There was only a quiet coolness, a guarded calm that seemed more calculated than grief-stricken. "Detective Whimsy," she said, her voice smooth but with a faint tremor. "Have you found anything?" Whimsy didn't answer right away. He simply studied her posture, the slight twitch in her fingers, the way her gaze darted toward the door, as if she were ready to leave at any moment. A subtle shift in her demeanor told him everything he needed to know. Miss Fenwick was nervous. But what was she hiding? "How well did you know your uncle?" Whimsy asked, his tone casual but with an edge of something sharper. I grew up with him," she replied, her lips trembling slightly. "He was a man of great intellect, but he was also distant. We were not particularly close." "I cannot say that I knew him well," Whimsy nodded, letting the conversation hang in the air for a moment. His mind was working fast, racing ahead, but he didn't let his eyes betray his thoughts. There was something off about the way she answered. It wasn't that she was lying. It was more the absence of something, emotion, perhaps, or sincerity. "Did your uncle ever mention any threats, any enemies?" Whimsy asked, still watching her closely. Miss Fenwick's eyes flickered with a hint of something, surprise, or maybe just anxiety. "No, none that I know of. I don't think he had many enemies. Not even in his academic circle," Whimsy pressed. "Could someone have wanted to harm him for his work, his research?" She hesitated, then shook her head. "He was a quiet man. Everyone respected him. There's no reason anyone would want him dead." Whimsy studied her face for a moment longer. There it was again, the hesitation. It wasn't what she was saying. It was what she wasn't saying. Something was being concealed, carefully hidden beneath her calm exterior. "Perhaps not," Whimsy said softly, finally turning to leave. "But everyone has a secret, Miss Fenwick, and sometimes those secrets can be lethal." As he stepped out of the room, Whimsy's mind was already churning with possibilities. Miss Fenwick's behavior, her controlled demeanor, the faint tension in her words was enough to convince him that she knew more than she was letting on. But what could she be hiding? And how did the watch, the powder, and the locked door fit into the puzzle? The game had only just begun. Whimsy moved through the house with quiet precision, his mind already piecing together the scattered threads of information, the subtle discrepancies in Miss Fenwick's responses, the faint tremor in her hands. It was all too deliberate. Something about her unease felt manufactured, as if she were trying to steer the conversation away from the truth. And the watch, still clutched in his hand, was another piece of the puzzle, misplaced. Yes, but intentionally so. He was drawn next to the other servants, those who had been in the house that night, each one a potential witness, each one with their own story. It was time to question them, and Whimsy knew instinctively that this was where the real cracks would begin to show. The first to be questioned was the butler, Mr. Richards, a man of middle age with a stiff posture and a clipped, almost robotic way of speaking. He had been the one to let the officers inside, and he had stood silent through much of the initial investigation. There was something in his demeanor, something rigid about his movements, that made Whimsy wonder if he was more than just a witness. "Mr. Richards," Whimsy began, his voice warm but penetrating, "I understand you were the first to enter the room after the discovery. Tell me, did you notice anything unusual?" The butler's lips tightened slightly. his eyes flicking toward the door before returning to meet Whimsy's gaze. "No, sir. Nothing at all out of the ordinary. The door was locked as it should be." Miss Fenwick found Mr. Fenwick in his usual chair, as if he'd simply fallen asleep. Whimsy's eyes narrowed. "Is that so? He was asleep? You're certain of that?" "Yes, sir," Richards replied, his voice unflinching. "I've been with the Fenwicks for nearly 20 years. I know the master's habits. He often worked late into the night." Whimsy let the silence stretch between them, his gaze never wavering. He knew it was a dangerous tactic to let the quiet drag on, but sometimes it was in the silence that a person's true intentions slipped through. Richards shifted his weight, his eyes darting briefly toward the window, a tell small but significant. "You know," Whimsy said after a long moment, "if you hadn't mentioned it, I would have assumed the master simply slipped into a restful sleep. But you, Mr. Richards, have had ample time to reflect on what you saw. Perhaps more time than you should have." The butler stiffened, his face tightening with discomfort. "I'm not sure what you mean." "Sir," Whimsy stood up, his expression unreadable. "I mean that you're far too calm for a man who's discovered a death in his own household. People don't simply walk into a room and find someone dead without a reaction. You must know that." "Mr. Richards." Richards opened his mouth as though to respond, but then closed it again, looking momentarily trapped by the accusation. "I didn't wish to alarm anyone, sir," he said finally, his voice now laced with a touch of defensiveness. "I kept the scene as it was until the authorities arrived." Whimsy could sense the lie lingering in the air, though he couldn't quite pinpoint the source. There was more to Richards's reaction than met the eye. Perhaps it was fear or perhaps it was guilt. "Of course. Well, thank you, Mr. Richards. I'll speak with you again soon." As he left the butler's presence, Whimsy felt the first thread of doubt pull at his mind. Richards had been too controlled, too rehearsed. It wasn't unusual for a servant to want to maintain order in a time of crisis, but there was something about the way he spoke that felt like an attempt to cover something up. The next witness to be questioned was Miss Fenwick's maid, a young woman named Clara who appeared both nervous and agitated. Unlike Richards, she seemed eager to speak, almost too eager. "Clara," Whimsy said, his voice gentle, "I understand you were in your room when the body was found, but you must have heard something." "Yes." Clara's eyes darted around the room as if searching for an escape, but when she spoke, her words tumbled out quickly, as if she were trying to outpace her own thoughts. I didn't hear anything, sir. But Miss Fenwick, she's been acting strange. She seemed upset, you know, but she didn't want anyone to help. She just kept saying she wanted to be alone with Mr. Fenwick." Whimsy raised an eyebrow. "Alone, after the discovery of the body? That seems unusual." "What did Miss Fenwick do then?" Clara shifted uncomfortably, her hands twisting in her lap. "She just sat there, in the sitting room, with her hands in her lap. I thought she might faint, but she didn't. She just stared at the floor and kept saying how it was all her fault." Whimsy leaned forward, his voice quiet but intense. "Her fault? What do you mean by that, Clara?" The maid's face flushed with embarrassment. I don't know, sir. I didn't hear everything. But she said something like, 'If only I hadn't done it, and I should have stopped him.' I didn't understand, sir. It didn't make sense." Whimsy's mind raced. That was the second reference to something Miss Fenwick had said that didn't add up. "Thank you, Clara. I'll speak to you again soon." As Clara hurried out of the room, Whimsy felt a knot tightening in his stomach. Miss Fenwick's words were growing more troubling by the minute. What was her connection to her uncle's death? Was it merely guilt or something more sinister? The final witness of the day was a curious figure, an older man, a scholar who had been one of Fenwick's colleagues. Dr. Harold Greaves had arrived late in the afternoon, still wearing his overcoat and looking distinctly uncomfortable in the presence of the police. He had been one of Fenwick's closest associates, a man of considerable reputation in academic circles. Yet, as Whimsy looked at him, he couldn't help but notice the strain in his eyes. "Dr. Greaves," Whimsy began, his tone polite but firm. "I understand you and Mr. Fenwick worked together on several projects. Did you have any disagreements recently?" Greaves hesitated, his lips pressing together tightly before he answered. Disagreements? No, not exactly. But we were discussing a matter of some importance, something that I'd rather not discuss in public, Detective. Whimsy's interest piqued. Is this matter something that could have led to Mr. Fenwick's death? Greaves looked around nervously, as if the walls themselves were listening. I don't know, I don't think so. But Mr. Fenwick had become very obsessed with his recent research. He was a brilliant man, but there were times when I feared he was pushing too hard. He was obsessed with a particular text, something ancient, a curse, perhaps, ridiculous, I know. But he was convinced that it had the power to unlock certain secrets of the human mind. Whimsy leaned back slightly, his mind racing. A curse? That sounded like something out of a novel, an excuse, a superstition, or perhaps a calculated deflection. And did you share his concerns? Greaves looked uneasy. I did, but only in part. Mr. Fenwick was a very passionate man, but sometimes I feared his pursuits were too dangerous. Whimsy stood up, his fingers idly tracing the edge of the desk. Thank you, Dr. Greaves. You've given me much to consider. As the scholar left the room, Whimsy felt a growing certainty that they were nearing something crucial. The contradictions were piling up, each one more telling than the last. Everyone had a different story, and none of them aligned perfectly with the facts. There was deception in every corner of the house, something hidden beneath the surface. The pieces were finally starting to fall into place, but there was still much to uncover, and the real question was whether anyone would confess before the truth came crashing down. The sun had dipped below the horizon, casting a long shadow over the Fenwick estate as Whimsy sat in the study, his mind awash with the conflicting accounts of the witnesses. The puzzle had become more intricate by the hour, with each new piece complicating the picture rather than simplifying it. Every suspect had their own story to tell, but none of them added up to a clear solution. There were just too many motives, too many contradictions. Whimsy ran his fingers over the watch in his hand again. The tarnished silver gleamed faintly. In the candlelight, he'd shown it to each of the witnesses, but none had claimed ownership. It was the type of thing one might keep on a mantelpiece, old, decorative, but it wasn't just an item of sentimental value. No, this watch had a purpose. It had been left in plain sight, a deliberate hint or a misdirection. Miss Fenwick had her secrets, that much was clear. Her reaction to the discovery of her uncle's body had been cold, almost rehearsed. And then, there were the troubling words Clara had overheard. If only I hadn't done it. What exactly was she trying to hide? The guilt was palpable, but guilt could stem from many things. If she had known something, was it a mere fear of responsibility, or was there something deeper, something more sinister? Then there was the maid, Clara herself, whose eagerness to speak seemed forced, a nervous energy that could be construed as guilt. But was it? Or was she simply overwhelmed by the situation? If Miss Fenwick had confessed to her, even indirectly, that guilt could easily be projected onto the maid. It was a dangerous game, planting ideas and suspicions where none existed. Whimsy stood up and walked over to the window, his eyes scanning the estate grounds below. The image of the dead scholar, slumped over in his chair, kept returning to his mind. Reginald Fenwick had been brilliant, yes, but also deeply immersed in obscure studies, subjects that bordered on obsession. Dr. Greaves's words echoed in Whimsy's thoughts. He was obsessed with a particular text. A curse, perhaps. Was it possible Fenwick had unlocked something so dangerous that it cost him his life? Or was Greaves simply trying to divert suspicion away from himself? The man had been the closest thing Fenwick had to a friend, and that, in itself, was a cause for scrutiny. Whimsy turned away from the window, his mind sharp with the fragments of the puzzle. There were too many threads, too many connections, and no single theory could account for all the evidence. Greed, revenge, jealousy, fear, all tangled together like a knot that refused to unravel. His thoughts were interrupted by the soft sound of footsteps approaching. He glanced up to see Inspector Kingsley entering the room, his face drawn with weariness. "What's your take on all this, Whimsy?" he asked, his tone weary. "The alibis are holding up, but it feels like we're chasing shadows here." Whimsy gestured to the chair across from him. "Sit down, Inspector. We need to talk about the evidence and the suspects." Kingsley took a seat, his expression pensive. "I'm listening." Whimsy placed the silver watch on the table between them, its gleam almost mocking in the dim light. "This is the key," he said. "A misplaced object left in plain sight. Someone wanted us to find it, but they didn't want us to recognize its importance. This watch wasn't just abandoned. It was planted, and the person who did that is the one we need to focus on." Kingsley raised an eyebrow. "You think it's a clue?" "It's more than that," Whimsy replied, his gaze steady. "It's a statement. The question is who would want to make that statement." Kingsley sat back, his fingers tapping against the armrest. "You've got the suspects, Miss Fenwick, Richards, Clara, and Dr. Greaves, but each of them has a reason to be involved, a motive. We know Fenwick's niece was close to him, but not that close. Clara's nervousness could just be fear. Greaves has an academic rivalry with Fenwick. And Richards, well, there's something about his composure that doesn't sit right with me." Whimsy nodded slowly, his eyes never leaving the watch. "Exactly. Each one has something to hide, but none of them are being entirely honest. Let's take them one by one." He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. "Miss Fenwick, her guilt is the most obvious, but it might also be the most misleading. Her words, 'If only I hadn't done it,' suggest a deep inner conflict. She may feel responsible, but is she guilty of murder? I doubt it. No. I think her role is more passive. She might have known something about her uncle's research, something dangerous. And if she didn't kill him, perhaps she was complicit in his death. But how does that fit with the rest of the evidence?" Kingsley interrupted, clearly confused. "The locked room, the lack of a struggle, that's the key," Whimsy said, raising a finger. "The lack of a struggle. Whoever killed Fenwick knew him well, enough to gain his trust. Miss Fenwick didn't kill him, but someone close to her did." He paused for a moment, letting the words hang in the air. "Now, Richards the butler. He's too calm, too controlled. I've been thinking about this. Why would someone in his position go to such lengths to keep the scene undisturbed? Why not call for help immediately? Why wait until the police arrived, and the watchee would have seen it? Yet he says nothing. That suggests a knowledge of the crime scene that goes beyond just a servant's duty. He's hiding something." "And Clara?" Kingsley asked. "What about her?" "Clara is more than just a scared maid," Whimsy replied, his eyes narrowing. "She's too eager to talk, too eager to offer details that could point to Miss Fenwick. But why would she do that? Could it be because Miss Fenwick confided in her? Or perhaps Clara was closer to Fenwick than anyone realized, closer than she's willing to admit." Kingsley's face darkened as he leaned forward. "What about Greaves, the scholar?" He seemed nervous too. Greaves," Whimsy said, smiling faintly. "Greaves is the most interesting of them all. He's the one who planted the idea of Fenwick's obsession with that ancient text. I think that was his way of casting suspicion away from himself. He doesn't want us looking too closely at him. He's been the academic mentor, the closest confidant, but that makes him the most likely person to have known about Fenwick's obsession. What if he saw it as a threat, something Fenwick was getting too close to, something Greaves could not allow to be discovered?" Kingsley was quiet for a long moment, digesting the implications. "So you think it was one of the four?" Whimsy stood and walked to the window, staring out into the darkening yard. "I think it was one of them, yes. But it was no simple crime of passion. Whoever killed Fenwick did it with purpose. This wasn't just about money or revenge. This was about something far deeper, a secret, a hidden truth that could destroy everything. And each of them had a reason to silence him." He turned back to face Kingsley, his expression resolute. "We need to focus on the connections, the subtle shifts in behavior. This wasn't a random act. It was calculated, and I believe we're about to uncover the motive hidden in plain sight." Kingsley nodded slowly, his face a mixture of skepticism and growing respect. "You think we'll find it?" "I know we will," Whimsy replied, his gaze steady. "It's just a matter of following the right thread." The following morning, the Fenwick estate was abuzz with a new air of triumph. News had spread like wildfire that the case was nearly solved. A breakthrough of sorts had come through, an unexpected one, as breakthroughs often were. Inspector Kingsley had arrived early, his face unusually bright, a sense of finality in his step. He had news, and it was good news, or so it seemed. Whimsy, however, stood apart, his eyes narrowing as Kingsley walked into the study holding a small, leather-bound notebook in his hand. "We've got it, Whimsy," Kingsley said, his voice carrying a new energy. "This is it. The key to everything." Whimsy didn't immediately respond, his gaze flickering between the notebook and the excited expression on Kingsley's face. He knew better than to rush to conclusions, even when the evidence seemed as clear as this. "What is it?" Whimsy asked, keeping his voice neutral but careful. "It's Fenwick's personal journal," Kingsley replied, placing the notebook on the desk in front of him, found in his study, hidden beneath a stack of old papers. "We've been over it, and it all checks out." Fenwick was obsessed with something, a discovery that seems to have been the catalyst for his murder. Whimsy opened the journal, flipping through the pages with a practiced eye. The entries were dated in a neat, precise hand, chronicling Fenwick's research into ancient texts, most notably a manuscript that seemed to hold clues to long-forgotten secrets that, if revealed, could alter history itself. He was paranoid. "Whimsy," Kingsley continued, his voice growing more certain. "The last few entries are filled with cryptic warnings, mentions of a dark force and those who would stop him at all costs. And then this." He pointed to a passage near the end, which described Fenwick's encounter with someone he feared might be willing to kill to protect the manuscript's secrets. "It seems like a clear motive for murder, doesn't it?" Whimsy ran his finger down the page, scanning the passage. The words were clear, unsettling. It was a man's final plea, his warning to anyone who might come after him. "I have seen the truth," Fenwick had written, "and now I must guard it with my life. Those who seek to silence me will stop at nothing." Whimsy closed the journal, his fingers lingering on the leather cover. "This is powerful evidence," he said slowly, "but it doesn't sit right with me." Kingsley blinked, surprised by the lack of enthusiasm in Whimsy's voice. "What do you mean?" "It's practically a confession. Fenwick was being hunted, and it seems the person who killed him was trying to prevent him from revealing the truth." "Yes, but this journal, it's too neat," Whimsy replied. "It's too convenient." If Fenwick had truly been on the verge of a monumental discovery, would he really have left behind such a clear and unmistakable clue? Wouldn't he have hidden it better or destroyed it altogether? Kingsley's expression faltered, and for a brief moment, Whimsy saw a doubt flicker in his eyes. "But it matches everything we've found, Whimsy. The motive, the opportunity, the fear. The murder isn't as simple as it seems," Whimsy interrupted. "This could be a carefully constructed illusion, a smokescreen designed to lead us down the wrong path. Whoever killed Fenwick wanted us to find this journal, wanted us to think that the motive was tied to his research. But I'm not convinced. It feels too obvious, too perfectly aligned." Kingsley hesitated, looking at the journal and then back at Whimsy. "You're saying it's a setup?" Whimsy nodded slowly. "Yes, someone is playing us. They want us to believe that Fenwick's death was the result of his research. But the more I think about it, the more I believe it wasn't just his research that got him killed. It's what he was willing to do to protect it." "Who would benefit from this?" Kingsley asked, his voice quieter now. "Who would want to frame Fenwick's work as the cause of his death?" "Everyone," Whimsy replied grimly. "Miss Fenwick, who stood to inherit everything. Richards, who had a long history with the family and could be trying to protect some personal interest. Even Dr. Greaves, who might have seen Fenwick's obsession as a threat to his own academic standing." Kingsley sighed, rubbing his forehead. "So what now?" "We were ready to announce the case as solved." Whimsy stood up, the puzzle pieces swirling in his mind, but the picture still incomplete. "We've been looking at this all wrong, Inspector. It's not the journal that holds the answer, it's the person who planted it." The two men stood in silence for a moment, the weight of Whimsy's words settling between them. "Do you suspect someone, then?" Kingsley asked, after a long pause. "I suspect everyone," Whimsy replied. "But I'm beginning to think the real killer is the one who stands to gain the most from a false conclusion, the one who has the most to lose if we discover what Fenwick was truly hiding." The case had seemed almost solved to neatly tied up with the discovery of the journal, but something gnawed at Whimsy's mind, something that felt like an invisible thread pulling him in another direction. there was one part of the puzzle that hadn't yet fallen into place. One detail that still lingered like an unanswered question that evening, as Whimsy sat alone in his room, his mind turning over the evidence. He found himself staring at the watch again, the silver watch that had been left behind at the crime scene. He hadn't paid it much mind after the journal's discovery, but now, as the details of the case began to settle, the significance of that watch crept back into his thoughts. It wasn't just a mislaid trinket, it was a deliberate marker, placed in that room for a reason. But the question remained, who had placed it there? He rose from his chair and walked to the desk, examining the watch once more. It had been found next to the body, yes, but it didn't belong to Fenwick, nor did it belong to Miss Fenwick, Clara, or even Greaves. It was a watch with no clear owner, an object that had simply appeared. But what if it was meant to draw attention to someone who wasn't immediately obvious? The realization hit him suddenly, like a bolt of lightning. The watch, it had been planted by someone who needed the focus to shift away from them. Someone who had a vested interest in ensuring that Fenwick's research remained locked away forever. The answer wasn't in the journal. The answer was in the one person who had everything to gain from this false victory. The one person who had been playing the long game all along. Whimsy's heart quickened as the pieces clicked into place. He knew who the real killer was. But the question now was whether the authorities would realize it in time, or if the criminal would strike again before they could act. The hours ticked by slowly as Whimsy sat in the study, turning over the details of the case in his mind like an old, familiar tune. Every new theory he entertained felt like a hollow echo of the last. The journal was a diversion, a carefully crafted ruse, but that didn't explain everything. The killer was still out there, hiding in plain sight, and there was something he had missed. A detail, an old connection, something buried deep within. The past that could tie everything together. He stood up, his fingers brushing over the now-closed journal on the desk. His gaze fell to the clock on the mantel, its ticking growing louder as the room grew quieter around him. It had been a long day, but his mind wasn't ready to rest, not yet. Something about the watch, the journal, and the web of suspects lingered in the air. Still unresolved, as if summoned by his thoughts, a memory stirred, something distant, something long buried. Whimsy's mind flicked back to an old case he had read about in the archives during his early days in the force. A case involving a group of scholars and an obscure theft that had rocked the academic world. Nearly 2 decades ago, the name Fenwick echoed in his memory, linked with a different set of crimes. The kind of crimes that were whispered about in corridors, swept under the rug of polite society. He pulled open a drawer of the desk and sifted through his stack of old papers, the faint scent of mildew clinging to the corners. It didn't take long before he found what he was looking for. A newspaper clipping from a forgotten crime that had shaken the academic community. The story was buried in a small corner of the article, barely making the front page. It was about an obscure manuscript, a rare text that had been stolen from a private collection years ago. A text linked to the very same scholarly circle to which Fenwick had once belonged. The case had been closed quickly, or so it seemed. The thief was never found, and the manuscript had disappeared without a trace. But the name Fenwick appeared once more, as one of the scholars rumored to have been caught up in the theft. He wasn't a suspect, not exactly, but the association was enough to keep him in the shadows of that case. His ties to the academic world had always been a little too close, too tangled for comfort. Whimsy sat back in his chair, his eyes narrowing as he reread the article, his fingers tracing the edges of the old paper. There it was again, the mention of Dr. Harold Greaves, the same Greaves who had been so eager to distance himself from Fenwick. In their current investigation, the two men had been involved in the same academic circles for years. But the question now was, how far did those circles stretch? Had Greaves been part of the original theft? Was Fenwick more involved in that crime than anyone had realized? He stood up abruptly, the pieces of the puzzle beginning to shift into a new configuration. There was a connection between the suspects, a thread that no one had noticed before. But it wasn't just about Fenwick's research or the manuscript, it was about the past and the lingering shadows it had cast over the present. The phone on the desk rang, slicing through the stillness of the room. Whimsy picked it up, his pulse quickening slightly. "Whimsy." The voice on the other end was familiar. "It's Kingsley. We've just had a breakthrough, something you might want to take a look at." Whimsy listened as Kingsley filled him in on the latest development. One of the officers had dug up an old case file, buried deep in the archives, one that mentioned a missing manuscript tied to the Fenwick family. It was the same manuscript that had disappeared all those years ago, the one that no one had ever found, and the one that had been so carefully hidden from public view. "How did this come up?" Whimsy asked, his voice steady despite the sudden surge of adrenaline. "The connection came up when we started digging into Fenwick's past." Kingsley replied, "It turns out Fenwick's late father was involved in that same theft. It wasn't just a matter of his son being caught up in a scandal, it was something much bigger. The manuscript was tied to a secret, something Fenwick's father had been protecting for years." Whimsy leaned against the desk, his mind racing. So Fenwick inherited more than just his father's name, he inherited a legacy of deception. Exactly. But that's not all. We've found something even more disturbing. Dr. Greaves was involved in the original theft, and we believe he may have been blackmailing Fenwick over it all these years. Fenwick knew that Greaves had a claim to the manuscript, and it seems that he was willing to do anything to protect it. He must have believed it was the key to something much larger, something far more dangerous. Whimsy closed his eyes for a moment, absorbing the gravity of the information. Everything was falling into place, but there was one thing that still didn't add up. The past was alive in the present, but there were too many unanswered questions. Why had the murder occurred now, after all these years of secrecy? Why had Fenwick been killed just as the truth seemed on the verge of coming to light? "I need to speak with Greaves again," Whimsy said, his voice low but certain. "This time, we'll get the truth out of him." Later that afternoon, Whimsy stood before the door to Dr. Greaves's office, his fingers pressing lightly against the wood. The scholar's reputation had always been one of intellectual brilliance, but Whimsy now knew that beneath that exterior, there was a darker truth, a truth tied to a crime that had been hidden for far too long. When Greaves opened the door, his sharp eyes seemed to narrow slightly at the sight of Whimsy, but his expression remained carefully composed. "Ah, Detective Whimsy, I wondered when you'd come by again. I trust you found the journal useful." Whimsy stepped into the room, his gaze scanning the bookshelves, the cluttered desk, the piles of papers. The office was a mirror of Greaves's mind disorder hidden beneath a veneer of order. "We've found more than just a journal, Dr. Greaves," Whimsy said, his voice even. "It seems you and Fenwick had more in common than you let on." Greaves's face tightened at the mention of Fenwick's name, and for a moment, Whimsy thought he saw a flicker of panic. "I don't know what you mean." Whimsy walked forward, placing the old newspaper article on the desk between them. "Fenwick's father was involved in the theft of a manuscript that was connected to a dangerous secret, and it appears that you were involved as well, back when it all began." Greaves's eyes shifted, but he remained silent. Whimsey continued, "You and Fenwick were tied together by more than just academic interests. You shared a past, a history of deceit, of protecting a dangerous secret, and it seems that secret is what ultimately led to Fenwick's death." Greaves's lips pressed into a thin line. "You think I killed him to protect some old secret? That's preposterous. It's not just a secret anymore, Dr. Greaves," Whimsy said, his tone growing colder. "It's a legacy, one that you both inherited. Fenwick knew it, and he was willing to go to great lengths to protect it. But you, Dr. Greaves, have been keeping it buried for far too long, and now it's all coming to light." Greaves's expression faltered, just for a moment, but in that moment, Whimsy saw the truth. The fear, the guilt, the knowledge that the past was finally catching up with him. The secret that had driven them all. Fenwick, Greaves, the others had come back to claim its victims, and now Whimsy was determined to make sure the past was laid bare. No matter the cost, the shadows of the past were closing in, and the game was finally coming to an end. The following morning, Whimsy stood alone in the drawing room, the silence of the house pressing in on him like a heavy fog. The puzzle had grown too complex to be solved with logic alone. Greaves had denied any involvement, but his words hadn't rung true. The guilt in his eyes was undeniable. Yet, despite the clues and the twisted connections, Whimsy couldn't shake the feeling that there was something deeper, something more elusive, lurking just beneath the surface. It was time for a different approach. He had spent the past few hours studying the suspects again, reviewing their alibis and motivations in his mind. But now, instead of diving deeper into their pasts, Whimsy decided to turn the tables. He needed to test them, not just their stories, but their characters. He needed to see how each one reacted under pressure, how far they were willing to go to maintain the facade of innocence, and he had the perfect idea in mind. The plan was simple yet unconventional, a carefully orchestrated set of events that would put them all under the spotlight, forcing them to show their true colors. It wasn't a matter of finding more evidence, it was about catching them in the act of deception, about creating an opportunity for them to reveal their guilt without realizing it. Whimsy made his way to the dining room, where Miss Fenwick had agreed to meet with him once more. He had told her that he needed her to help clarify a few details of the investigation. Details that he was now beginning to suspect were carefully planted in the minds of the suspects. When she entered, she looked tired, but there was a certain sharpness in her eyes that made Whimsy suspect she hadn't been sleeping well. "Good morning, Miss Fenwick," he said with a smile, motioning for her to sit. "I hope you've had a restful night." "I suppose," she replied, her tone clipped, though she sat down without hesitation. "What is it that you need from me today, Detective?" Whimsy observed her closely as she took her seat, noting the way she folded her hands neatly in her lap, her fingers trembling ever so slightly. He had seen this nervousness before, the subtle signs of someone who was trying desperately to control their emotions. "I've been thinking, Miss Fenwick," Whimsy said, choosing his words carefully, "about your uncle's research. You mentioned earlier that you were aware of some of his more unconventional ideas. I'm curious, what exactly did he believe he was protecting? What was so dangerous about the research?" Her eyes flashed with a moment of panic, but she quickly masked it with an air of indifference. "I don't know what you mean, Detective. My uncle's work was his own. I didn't understand half of it." Whimsy nodded thoughtfully. "Of course. But it's strange, isn't it? A man like Fenwick, with all his brilliance, working in isolation, becoming obsessed with something no one else could see." He leaned forward slightly, his voice soft but firm. "You see, Miss Fenwick, I think your uncle was more than just a scholar. I believe he was onto something that others would kill to keep buried." She stiffened, her lips parting to speak, but no words came. Whimsy's eyes never left her face. "I know you've been hiding something, Miss Fenwick. I can see it in your eyes. It's not about the money. It's not even about your uncle's research. It's about the fear of what might come to light. If the truth gets out." Her gaze faltered for a moment, and in that split second, Whimsy saw a crack in her composure. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but it was there. He had her attention. "Tell me, Miss Fenwick," Whimsy said, his tone shifting to one of quiet persuasion. "What would you do to protect your family's reputation? To keep a dangerous secret buried forever?" She swallowed hard, her chest rising and falling as though she were struggling to catch her breath. It was a subtle reaction, one that most people would have missed, but Whimsy was trained to notice the smallest shifts in behavior. She was close to breaking. He could feel it. "I don't know what you mean," she repeated, her voice strained. Whimsy smiled slightly. "Of course, you don't, but I suspect you know more than you're letting on. And if you think that your uncle's death is merely the result of some academic obsession gone wrong, then I'm afraid you're very mistaken." The tension in the room thickened, and Miss Fenwick shifted in her seat. For a long moment, she was silent, her face unreadable. Then, finally, she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "I never wanted any of this, but it wasn't supposed to be like this. I didn't plan for it to go this far." Whimsy's heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean?" She faltered, her eyes darting toward the door. "I didn't know what else to do. I didn't want him to find out the truth. I couldn't let him know everything. He was too close to something dangerous." Whimsy leaned forward, his mind racing. "What truth, Miss Fenwick? What was your uncle getting so close to?" Before she could respond, there was a sudden knock at the door, sharp and insistent. Miss Fenwick jumped, the nervous energy in her body suddenly shifting to something more erratic. Whimsy held up a hand to pause her. "Come in," he called, his voice controlled. The door opened, and Richards entered, his face pale and tense. "Detective Whimsy, there's been a development," he said, his voice low and filled with a certain unease. "The police have found something that might explain the motive behind Mr. Fenwick's death." Whimsy's attention snapped to Richards, his pulse quickening. "What is it?" Richards hesitated, glancing at Miss Fenwick before lowering his voice further. "We've discovered a hidden compartment in Mr. Fenwick's study. Inside, there was an old journal, a journal that didn't belong to him. It was signed by Dr. Greaves." Whimsy's mind went into overdrive. Greaves had known Fenwick's secrets. He had been involved in the original theft. Yes, but now this. It seemed almost a perfect, too much of a coincidence. And yet, the truth was right there, waiting to be uncovered. "That's not all," Richards continued, his eyes darting nervously toward Miss Fenwick. "The journal mentions a convergence, a meeting of scholars who sought to control the manuscript's power. It wasn't just about knowledge, it was about power, the kind that can destroy lives." Whimsy turned back to Miss Fenwick, his expression hardening. "You didn't just inherit your uncle's research, did you? You inherited his fear. You inherited the legacy of a secret so dangerous that it had to be buried, even at the cost of a life." Miss Fenwick's eyes widened as the truth began to settle in around her, the reality of her situation pressing down on her like a vice. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came. Whimsy didn't need her confession, not yet. He had already seen everything he needed to see. The cracked facade, the fear, the trembling hands. It all pointed to one thing: Miss Fenwick was part of the web, but not the whole story. He turned to Richards. "Gather the others," he said quietly, the decision clear in his mind. "It's time we uncovered the rest of the truth." But as he stepped away from the scene, the shadow of suspicion still loomed, and in the back of his mind, a single thought nagged at him, a whisper that refused to go away. There was still one more twist, and the real killer was just waiting to be exposed. The air in the house seemed to shift overnight, thick with tension, as Whimsy gathered the suspects in the drawing room, preparing to confront them with the new evidence. A feeling of urgency hung in the air. He had learned more than he had expected in such a short time. The journal, Richard's discovery, and Miss Fenwick's reluctant admission all pointed to something deeper than mere academic rivalry. The secrets tied to Fenwick's research were more dangerous than he had initially realized. The murder wasn't just an isolated incident. It was part of a much larger, more intricate game, one that he was still only beginning to understand. Miss Fenwick, Dr. Greaves, Richards, and Clara all assembled, their faces marked with the same anxiety they'd worn since the beginning. Whimsy had no illusions. They were all hiding something. But what? The journal, the mysterious convergence, the hidden compartments in Fenwick's study. These clues had pushed him closer to the truth. But the final puzzle piece still eluded him. "Everyone, please, take a seat," Whimsy instructed as he closed the door behind him, shutting them in the room together. His eyes scanned the group, observing the nervous glances and the strained postures. It was clear that Miss Fenwick was still on edge, her hands twisting in her lap. Dr. Greaves' face was tight, his lips drawn into a thin, controlled line, while Richards stood by the window, his gaze fixed outside, avoiding eye contact. Clara, as usual, remained a step behind the rest, shifting uneasily. "I have gathered you all here because there is no more room for pretense," Whimsy said, his voice firm but measured. "We are closing in on the truth. The journal found in Fenwick's study has confirmed some of our suspicions. It seems your uncle was hiding more than just research. He was protecting something dangerous, a secret tied to a manuscript that others have killed to keep buried." He let the words hang in the air for a moment, watching the reactions closely. Miss Fenwick looked up sharply, her face pale. Greaves' expression remained unreadable, but the flicker of tension in his jawline told Whimsy all he needed to know. Richards, however, seemed almost relieved. It was a subtle shift, but it was there. "I've also learned that Dr. Greaves had a hand in a similar incident. Years ago, an academic theft tied to Fenwick's father," Whimsy continued, his eyes locking onto Greaves, daring him to deny it. "Now, I have one final question. Who else knew about the manuscript? Who else wanted it, badly enough, to kill for it?" The room grew heavier with silence. No one spoke. Miss Fenwick shifted uncomfortably, but she didn't meet Whimsy's gaze. Greaves, for all his composure, looked like he was waiting for something, perhaps for the truth to unfold, or for someone else to make the first move. "Do you have anything to say, Dr. Greaves?" Whimsy asked, his voice a quiet challenge. For a moment, Greaves didn't respond. His eyes flitted briefly toward Miss Fenwick, and then he sighed, a long, controlled exhalation that seemed to carry the weight of years. "I don't believe it matters anymore," he said slowly, his voice almost resigned. "The past, it's not something we can undo. You'll never know the full extent of what Fenwick was involved in. We both tried to bury it, but there were always people looking, always people waiting." Whimsy's gaze sharpened, his pulse quickening. Who was waiting? But just as Greaves was about to answer, the door flew open with a loud bang, interrupting the moment. A uniformed officer rushed in, his face pale and panicked. "Detective Whimsy, we've lost something," the officer said, his voice shaking. "The journal, it's gone." Whimsy's heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean it's gone?" "It was in the evidence room," the officer stammered, his eyes wide with disbelief. "But when we went back to check this morning, it's vanished. Completely." The room seemed to close in around him. The tension, which had already been high, spiked to a new level. Whimsy turned to face the others, his mind racing. How could this be? The journal had been the key to everything he had thought. They were so close to unraveling the truth, and now it was gone. Just like that. Miss Fenwick stood up abruptly, her face a mask of confusion and fear. What are you saying? How could it have just disappeared?" "It doesn't make sense," the officer continued, looking at the floor. "We searched the whole room. There's no sign of a break-in, no forced entry. It's as if it was taken from right under our noses." Whimsy's eyes narrowed. "Was anyone in the room last night? Did anyone have access?" The officer swallowed hard. "There was only one person, Richards. He came in late last night, just after hours, to retrieve some personal belongings." Whimsy turned sharply to face Richards, who had been standing near the window. The man's expression was unreadable, but his eyes were darting now, a flicker of something unsettling passing over his features. "Richards," Whimsy said, his voice low but insistent, "you had access to the evidence room." Richards remained silent. For a beat, his eyes flicking toward the door. "I didn't take it," he finally said, his voice tight. "You have to believe me." Whimsy's mind was spinning. Richards had been the only one with direct access, and now, just when the case seemed to be closing in on the truth, the evidence had disappeared. Was this a coincidence, or was someone deliberately trying to derail the investigation? The idea that Richards had taken the journal couldn't be ruled out, but it didn't sit right with him. He had seen Richards' nervousness, but it was more of a man caught in a situation beyond his control than someone guilty of sabotage. Miss Fenwick was staring at Richards, her face full of disbelief. You took the journal." "No," Richards snapped, his tone defensive now. "I swear, I didn't take anything." Whimsy raised a hand to silence them, his mind clicking into place as he considered the possibility that Richards wasn't the true culprit. If the journal was removed from the evidence room by someone who had access to it, then someone else knew exactly when to strike. He turned back to face the rest of the room, his gaze sweeping over the group. "And that means someone in this room is working against us." Double quotes Clara, who had been silent up until now, shifted uneasily on her feet. She looked from one person to another, as if trying to figure out the best moment to speak. "Detective, I don't know what happened to the journal, but I've been thinking about something." Whimsy's gaze snapped to her. "What do you mean?" Clara hesitated, her eyes flickering nervously to Miss Fenwick. "It's just, before the police arrived this morning, I heard something, a conversation between Dr. Greaves and Richards. It was quick, but it was about the journal. I didn't understand all of it, but they mentioned something about covering their tracks and making sure the truth stayed buried." Whimsy's heart stopped for a beat. The last part of the puzzle had just fallen into place. He turned sharply to Greaves, his suspicions finally forming into a solid, dangerous conclusion. "You," Whimsy said, his voice cold. "You knew the journal was our key to unlocking everything, and you did everything you could to make sure it never saw the light of day." Greaves didn't flinch. Instead, he looked at Whimsy with a calm, almost amused expression. "You're too late, detective. The truth is already buried, and it's staying that way." The words were like a gunshot in the quiet room, and in that moment, Whimsy knew they were closer to the truth than ever before, perhaps too close for comfort. But the game was far from over. The stakes had just risen higher. Now, he had to find a way to get the truth out before it was buried forever. The room had grown unbearably tense. Every word that had passed between them now seemed loaded, weighted with suspicion. Miss Fenwick's eyes were wide with fear, her hands trembling at her sides. Richards stood motionless by the window, his posture stiff, his back to the group. Clara, ever silent, avoided everyone's gaze, her lips pressed into a thin line. And Greaves looked like a man who knew the game was over, but still clung to the idea that there might be a way out. Whimsy let the silence stretch for a moment longer before speaking again. "The journal," he said quietly, his gaze fixed on Greaves. "You knew what was in it. You knew its importance, and now it's gone." Greaves met his eyes, his lips curling into a thin, almost imperceptible smile. "You misunderstand, detective," he said, his voice dripping with something too calculated to be genuine. "The journal was only ever a small piece of a much larger puzzle. You think you've uncovered something, but you've only scraped the surface. You'll find nothing of value in that journal, nothing that will help you solve anything. If you were truly interested in the truth, you'd understand that." Whimsy felt his pulse quicken as he processed the implications of Greaves' words. Was he admitting to something? Was he toying with them? Or was there a deeper level to this entire deception that even Whimsy hadn't yet seen? The loss of the journal had been a blow, but it wasn't the end. Not yet. "Someone wanted us to believe that journal was the key," Whimsy said, his voice low but certain. "Someone has been planting clues, manipulating the evidence, and now they've stolen it, covered their tracks, but they've made one fatal mistake." Greaves' smile faltered, just for a split second. But it was enough for Whimsy to notice. "That's right," Whimsy continued, his eyes sharp. "The truth isn't in the journal. It's in the people around us. It's in the reactions, the things they've done, the lies they've told. It's not about what's been stolen. It's about who's behind it." Greaves' eyes darkened, his smile gone now. "You're grasping at straws, Whimsy. You'll never find what you're looking for." "Maybe not," Whimsy said, his voice quiet. "But I'm not the only one looking, am I, Richards?" He turned his gaze to Richards, whose tense posture had finally cracked. "You've been very quiet, considering you were the last person to have access to the evidence room. What were you doing in there late at night, and why didn't you report that the journal was missing when you first noticed?" Richards stiffened, his gaze shifting nervously toward the door. He opened his mouth, but no words came. Sweat beaded on his forehead, and he swallowed visibly, as if trying to fight the rising tide of guilt threatening to overwhelm him. Whimsy stepped forward, keeping his voice calm but insistent. "I think you know what happened to the journal. You know who took it." Miss Fenwick looked at Richards, confusion and distrust written clearly across her face. "What are you talking about, Richards?" she asked. "You've been so distant lately. You've known more about all this than you've let on." Richards swallowed again, his hand moving instinctively to his coat pocket. "I didn't take it," he said, though the words were weak. "I didn't have anything to do with it." Whimsy's eyes narrowed as he caught the movement. Richards was hiding something. Whimsy could feel it, the way his fingers fidgeted, the way his eyes darted around the room, the nervous energy in his stance. "You didn't take it," Whimsy repeated, taking a step closer. "Then why were you at the evidence room last night? Why were you there, after hours, with no one around to see you? What were you doing in there?" Richards, the man, opened his mouth as if to speak, but no words came. Finally, he dropped his gaze to the floor. I didn't want to get involved, but I had to see it for myself," he whispered. Whimsy's patience was beginning to wear thin. "See what?" Richards hesitated before speaking again, his voice barely above a whisper. The manuscript. I had to know what it said. Fenwick, he knew something. He was too close to the truth. I couldn't let him finish. I couldn't let anyone find out about the manuscript. The words hung in the air like a death sentence. For the first time, Richard's true motive came into focus. He hadn't just been involved in the theft years ago. He had been trying to prevent Fenwick from revealing what he had discovered, from unlocking whatever secret lay hidden in that manuscript. The murder, the manipulation, the lies, it was all part of a plan to keep that truth buried. And Richards had played his part in that plan. Whimsy turned back to Greaves, whose eyes had widened ever so slightly. You knew, didn't you? You knew Richards was going to steal the journal. You knew he had the perfect motive to cover his tracks. You and he both had something to lose if the manuscript was ever found. You've been hiding the truth for far too long, haven't you? Greaves' lips pressed together in a tight line, but he didn't deny it. Instead, he said, "You think you understand everything, Whimsy, but you're still missing the bigger picture. Richards and I, yes, we've been involved, but we're not the only ones." The words hit Whimsy like a punch to the gut. What are you saying?" he asked, his voice tense. "I'm saying," Greaves continued, his tone dark and deliberate, "that this isn't just about Fenwick. This isn't just about a manuscript. You think the people in this room are the only ones who've had a stake in hiding the truth. There's more to this than you know, much more. The journal, the manuscript, they're only the beginning. You haven't even scratched the surface." The weight of Greaves' words settled like a storm cloud in the room. The stakes were higher than Whimsy had imagined. What had Fenwick been truly working on? What was so dangerous about this manuscript that it had cost him his life and now, it seemed, cost them all their futures? Whimsy's mind raced. He had thought he was close to the truth, but now, in the wake of Richard's confession, things had become far more complicated. The journal was gone, the evidence had vanished, and the people he thought he could trust were slowly revealing themselves to be part of something far more sinister. But one thing was clear now: whoever had been manipulating them, whoever had been working behind the scenes, had just exposed themselves. They had underestimated Whimsy, and now it was his turn to turn the tables. "Tell me," Whimsy said, his voice sharp and commanding. "Who else is involved? Who else is part of this conspiracy?" Greaves' silence spoke volumes. The truth was just within reach, but as the walls began to close in, Whimsy knew that finding it would require more than just words. It would take action, swift, decisive action, because if there was one thing he was certain of now, it was that the game was far from over, and someone somewhere was still trying to bury the truth. The moment Greaves fell into silence, Whimsy felt the chill return, not from the weather, but from the realization that this conspiracy ran deeper than he'd imagined. A fragment of the truth had emerged, but something still didn't fit. He could feel it, like a draft creeping in through a window left open an inch too wide. The people before him were not just reacting to exposure, they were managing it, measuring their responses carefully, as though they had rehearsed this moment. In private more than once, he allowed the silence to linger, watching the others. Richards had retreated into himself, visibly shaken by what he'd admitted. Miss Fenwick stood beside the fireplace, staring at the embers, her face unreadable. Clara sat rigid in her chair, her eyes cast downward, as if trying to will herself. Invisible, Greaves simply waited stone-faced, as if whatever burden he had been carrying for years had now merely shifted its shape. Whimsy was tired, but his mind was sharpening. He began mentally reassembling the puzzle with fresh eyes: the stolen journal, the web of guilt, the mention of a larger conspiracy. It all pointed to a conspiracy that predated Fenwick's death, and the manuscript was merely the fuse. Then he remembered something. It was absurdly minor, buried in the back of his mind like dust beneath a rug. A comment Richards had made days ago, in the study when the journal had first been discovered. Whimsy had asked whether anything else had been found with it, and Richards had said, no, just that battered volume and a few of those ridiculous black ink bottles. At the time, it hadn't struck him as odd, but now, with the journal gone, and with Richards' confession laid bare, the phrase returned like an echo with new meaning. Those ridiculous black ink bottles. Why mention them at all, and why ridiculous? Ink bottles wouldn't have stood out unless something was wrong with them or unless they weren't what they seemed to be. Whimsy turned to Richards. When you found the journal, you said there were ink bottles beside it. Richards hesitated, then nodded, clearly unsure where Whimsy was going. Yes, they looked old. I thought they were just relics Fenwick kept for aesthetic reasons. Were they dusty? I know. Actually, now that you mention it, they weren't. They looked new, but the glass was old. Why? Whimsy didn't answer right away. He turned to Miss Fenwick. Did your uncle use ink pens recently? Did he write with bottled ink? She looked puzzled. Not that I saw. He mostly typed his notes. His handwriting had become shaky. So, Whimsy said slowly, piecing it together aloud, why keep bottles of ink near his journal if he wasn't using them? And why would they be clean unless someone placed them there recently? The realization landed with sudden clarity. It wasn't just ink. It was the ink bottle. He spun around and crossed the room to where a small bag of evidence had been temporarily placed on a side table, the only item retrieved before the journal vanished. It was one of the bottles, scooped up by an officer in the chaos. He picked it up and held it to the light. Inside, the ink was dark and still, but the base of the bottle was slightly thicker than it should have been, like a false bottom. Without waiting, he uncorked the bottle and reached in with a thin metal letter opener. The blade hit resistance. Glass shouldn't have had a bottom there, it should have gone deeper. With careful pressure, he twisted the edge of the opener and heard a click. The bottom of the bottle detached, revealing a tightly folded page. Dry despite the surrounding liquid dot, he unfolded it with care. It wasn't a letter, nor a page from a book. It was a cipher of tightly packed symbols, written in ink unmistakably, darker than anything Whimsy had seen in Fenwick's known handwriting. A code, or perhaps the key to the manuscript itself. Good Lord, Richards muttered, inching closer. He hid it, inside ink. Greaves let out a harsh breath. Of course he did. Typical Fenwick, always 3 moves ahead. Whimsy examined the page more closely. There, in the margin, was a tiny notation in Fenwick's hand. The words were faint, but legible. Only the false ink will reveal what's hidden. It clicked. Not only had Fenwick hidden information inside the bottle, he had written something with ink that required specific conditions to be read. Invisible ink, and the missing journal. Perhaps it was never meant to be the real vessel of knowledge. The truth had been hidden in plain sight all along, beneath the illusion of ink. Miss Fenwick, he said, still holding the page. Did your uncle ever mention chemical treatments, acids, heat-reactive substances? She blinked. Yes, once. He had me buy him lemon oil and ethanol. I thought it was for cleaning, but he kept them in the same drawer as his notes. He was using them to create invisible ink, Whimsy said, which means even the journal might not have been as important as it appeared. The real secrets were encoded elsewhere. The thief, whoever took the journal, was playing the wrong game. Whimsy turned to Clara. You've been quiet through all this, but you saw the bottles, didn't you? Clara flinched at the sudden address. I thought they were perfume bottles at first. They were decorative. It didn't seem important. Exactly, Whimsy said. None of this seemed important until it was too late. That's the pattern, isn't it? Everyone saw pieces, but dismissed them because they didn't look dangerous. Fenwick was counting on that. The secrets were never truly hidden. They were disguised. Greaves stared at the page in Whimsy's hands, his expression finally cracking into something closer to fear. Then frustration. Do you know what that cipher could unlock? He said hoarsely. If he finished decoding the manuscript. I don't need to know the specifics, Whimsy said. I only need to know that someone killed a man to stop it from being read. Greaves didn't reply, but the silence that followed felt different, like the weight of something ancient had finally been unearthed. Whimsy looked again at the small paper and the glistening ink that hid nothing and everything at once. The pattern had emerged not through logic alone, but through misdirection, through silence, and above all, through the things everyone had chosen not to see. He folded the paper carefully and turned toward the door. The final move was near now. The real answer lay just ahead, so close he could feel it pulsing beneath the surface. Waiting for the last lock to click open, the air in the room felt suddenly charged, as though the very walls were closing in on Whimsy didn't look at the others immediately. He didn't need to. The page in his hand, the cipher that had so casually slipped from a bottle of ink, told him everything he needed to know. The pieces were falling into place, but not the way he had expected. As he turned, his mind raced through the implications. He had believed for so long that the murder, the theft, the elaborate web of lies had all been about the manuscript, or at least about what it contained. Greed, betrayal, fear, those had been his assumptions. But as he stared at the cipher in his hand, a subtle shift took place in his thinking. What if it wasn't just about knowledge? What if the manuscript wasn't the key to power or wealth, but the key to something far more insidious? He looked up at the room of suspects. Miss Fenwick was still standing by the fire, staring at the ashes, her face pale, her eyes filled with something close to regret, or was it guilt? Richards hadn't moved from the window. Greaves still sat composed, but there was a flicker of tension that hadn't been there before. And Clara, she stood by the door, her arms crossed tightly, her eyes darting between the others as though waiting for the world to stop spinning. "Tell me, Miss Fenwick," Whimsy began, his voice low, but sharper than before. "How far were you willing to go to protect your uncle's work? How deep does this go? Was it truly just a matter of the manuscript? Or was there something else, something hidden behind all of this?" She didn't answer right away. Her lips trembled, and for the briefest of moments, Whimsy saw the cracks in her demeanor widen, like old paint peeling away from a wall. Then she inhaled sharply and spoke, her voice strained but firm. "You still don't understand. It's not the manuscript that's the issue. It was what he was going to do with it, my uncle. He wasn't just uncovering old secrets. He was creating something, and it was too dangerous." Whimsy's pulse quickened. "Creating something? What do you mean?" "Something that could change everything," she replied, her voice thick with emotion. "He was obsessed with the idea that knowledge could be controlled. He was planning to use the manuscript as a blueprint, but not for power or wealth. He wanted to reshape reality itself." Whimsy's mind raced. "Reshape reality?" Miss Fenwick nodded. "It sounds mad, I know. But my uncle believed that by combining specific knowledge from ancient texts with modern understanding, he could—" She hesitated, eyes flickering nervously to Greaves, as though unsure of how much to reveal. "He thought he could manipulate human perception, change the way people saw the world." Whimsy could barely contain his shock. "You're telling me your uncle was trying to alter human perception, physically manipulate the mind? That's absurd." "It's not absurd," Miss Fenwick snapped, a trace of bitterness creeping into her voice. "That's exactly what he was doing, and I had to stop him. Do you understand now? The manuscript wasn't just some historical artifact, it was a tool. And if it fell into the wrong hands, it could—" She stopped, her voice faltering as the weight of her own words began to sink in. Whimsy's mind was spinning, altering perception, rewriting reality. It sounded like madness, but something in her voice told him she wasn't lying. She believed it. And what's more, she had clearly been afraid of what her uncle might accomplish if left unchecked. "Miss Fenwick," he said slowly, "why didn't you tell me this earlier? Why keep the truth hidden?" She looked down at the floor. "I couldn't. If anyone knew, they'd have stopped him. But I couldn't do that. He was still my uncle. After all, I thought if I helped him finish, maybe the knowledge would be controlled. But then the more he worked, the more dangerous it became. I had to make sure no one would ever use it." She took a shaky breath, finally lifting her eyes to meet his. "That's why I killed him." Whimsy froze. The words hit him like a hammer, and for a moment, he couldn't comprehend them. "You—" He trailed off, his voice cracking as the revelation dawned on him. "You killed your uncle to stop him from using the manuscript." Miss Fenwick nodded, her eyes filled with a strange mixture of sorrow and relief. "I didn't want to. But I had no choice. If the knowledge had been released, if someone with the wrong motives got their hands on it, he would have changed everything." He wasn't thinking about the consequences. He was consumed by the idea of control. Whimsy took a step back, his mind whirling. He had suspected many things during the investigation: greed, betrayal, perhaps even a personal vendetta. But this, the true motive, was far darker, far more complex than anything he could have imagined. Miss Fenwick had murdered her uncle, not out of malice, but out of a twisted sense of duty. She had killed to prevent a world-altering catastrophe, and in doing so, she had ensured that the manuscript and the dangerous knowledge contained within, it would never see the light of day. But as the pieces of the puzzle clicked together, Whimsy couldn't shake the feeling that something still wasn't right. Miss Fenwick's confession seemed too neat, too convenient. He turned to Greaves, his gaze piercing. "What about you? You knew about the manuscript. You knew about the research. How deep were you involved in this scheme? Did you want to use it, too?" Greaves remained silent for a long moment, but when he spoke, his voice was heavy with a kind of grim resignation. "I didn't want to use it, Whimsy, but I wanted to contain it. Fenwick's research, it wasn't just about the manuscript. He was drawing on concepts from all over ancient philosophy, experimental psychology, quantum mechanics. I couldn't let him push forward with it. No one could. I wanted to stop him, too, but I wasn't going to kill him." Whimsy's eyes narrowed. "Then why did you lie? Why did you cover for Miss Fenwick when the journal went missing?" Greaves' eyes flickered toward the window. "Because she wasn't just trying to protect herself. She was protecting us all. The manuscript, if it had been fully decoded, could have triggered a chain reaction. It could have altered our entire understanding of reality, of human consciousness, and once it was finished, there would have been no going back." The chilling weight of his words settled over Whimsy. The stakes weren't just about crime and punishment anymore. They were about something far more profound. Miss Fenwick hadn't been trying to protect her uncle's legacy. She had been trying to protect the world. As the room fell into a heavy silence, Whimsy understood. This had never been about money, power, or revenge. The murder wasn't just an act of violence, it was a desperate, final attempt to stop a madman from unraveling the very fabric of human existence. Miss Fenwick had killed her uncle, but in doing so, she had become both the villain and the hero in a far larger narrative. And the worst part, she hadn't been the only one who thought she was doing the right thing. Whimsy looked at her, the sorrow and horror on his face undeniable. "You really believed it was the only way?" Her gaze met his, filled with a quiet, almost mournful acceptance. "Sometimes the truth is too dangerous to live." The truth had been uncovered, but it was clear now that no one could ever walk away from this unscathed. Not even Whimsy. Whimsy's mind was still reeling from the revelation. Miss Fenwick's confession, however twisted it seemed, had shattered the narrative he had been building. The motivations behind the murder, the strange obsession with the manuscript, and the unsettling knowledge hidden in plain sight, all of it now circled him like a deadly game, and he had no intention of losing. He stood in the center of the room, his gaze flicking from one person to the next, but his mind was focused on the bigger picture. Miss Fenwick, her confession still hanging in the air, stood motionless near the fireplace, her face drawn and pale. Richards, who had been silently processing everything, had started to fidget with his cufflinks, as though preparing for something he wasn't quite ready for. Greaves, though outwardly calm, had a tightness in his jaw that betrayed his unease. Clara, still standing by the door, had become an even quieter presence. Perhaps she, too, had begun to feel the pressure of the walls closing in. Whimsy watched them all carefully. Considering every angle, he had known from the start that there was more to this case than met the eye. And now he was certain that the true motive had finally been laid bare. Yet something still nagged at him, an instinct telling him that the story wasn't over, that Miss Fenwick's confession wasn't the final act in this tangled drama. The trap, Whimsy realized, wasn't just for the murderer, it was for all of them. The truth had surfaced, but it was buried beneath layers of deception. It wasn't enough to simply expose the crime. He needed to make them face it. Each one of them needed to reckon with the consequences of their actions. Whimsy took a deep breath, letting the tension in the room thicken as he began to speak. "I'm sure you all think you've been clever," he began, his voice calm but filled with unyielding authority. "The lies, the manipulation, the way you tried to cover up what was done. But here's the thing. Every step you took, every move you made, only brought me closer to the truth. And now we're at the end of the line." The words hung in the air like a challenge. Miss Fenwick's eyes flickered with something, perhaps guilt or fear, but it was too quick to tell. She opened her mouth as though to speak, but Whimsy raised a hand to silence her. "You've told me what you think I need to hear." He continued, "But I've been listening, and now I understand it all. It wasn't just your uncle's research, was it? It wasn't just the manuscript or the ink bottles. No, what you've all been hiding is something far more dangerous than you realize." He turned slowly to Greaves. "You knew about the manuscript. You knew it was dangerous. But you wanted to control it. Not for power, no. You didn't care about power. You wanted to contain it. You thought you could manage the chaos, but you couldn't. Could you? Not when Miss Fenwick made sure the world would never see the research complete." Greaves didn't flinch, but his lips tightened into a thin line. "And Richards," Whimsy said, glancing at the man who had been so quiet throughout it all, "you've been part of the cover-up from the beginning. Your silence was your complicity. You had the perfect opportunity to stop things, to expose what was happening, but you chose to stay in the shadows, hoping it would all blow over. But it didn't, did it?" Richards shifted uncomfortably, his eyes darting to the others, looking for some sign of support. None came. Whimsy's gaze softened, but there was still a sharpness in his voice. "The truth is, none of you could control what was happening. Not Miss Fenwick, not Greaves, not you. Richards, you were all players in a game that had already spiraled out of control. And in your desperation to keep the knowledge hidden, you murdered the only person who could have put an end to it all." There was no reply, only the heavy weight of silence pressing down on them. But Whimsy could feel the tension, the shift in the room as the full weight of his words sank in. Finally, Miss Fenwick spoke, her voice trembling with the remnants of her resolve. "I did what had to be done. I didn't want to, but I had no choice. I couldn't let him finish it. I couldn't let him make the world believe that what he had was the key to everything." Whimsy's eyes met hers, unwavering. "And yet, you still think you were protecting the world, don't you? That you were saving it from something too powerful to control. But in doing so, you've trapped us all, because the truth is what you did isn't just a murder, it's the beginning of a much darker story. A story where the knowledge you wanted to keep hidden could still change everything." Even now, for the first time, Miss Fenwick seemed to falter. Her eyes, which had been filled with determination, now flickered with doubt. She took a step back, as though trying to shrink from the confrontation. Whimsy took another step forward, his voice low but insistent. "This ends now. The truth has already slipped through your fingers. The manuscript was never the most dangerous thing in this house. The real danger was the idea behind it, the willingness to take a life, to bury a truth, just to preserve the illusion of control." His words landed like a blow, and he could see the realization spreading across Miss Fenwick's face. The fear, the regret, the understanding that, in her attempt to protect the world from her uncle's work, she had unleashed something far worse, a vicious cycle of deception that had no clear end. And then there was the quiet, a suffocating stillness, broken only by the ticking of the clock in the corner of the room. It was as though the entire world had stopped moving, waiting for one last turn in the game. But Whimsy wasn't waiting anymore. He knew what had to be done. He turned to Richards and Greaves. "Call the authorities. It's over. The game is up." Richards opened his mouth to protest, but the words died on his lips. Greaves, for once, said nothing. He simply stood there, looking, as though the burden of everything he had done had finally caught up with him. The trap had been set, and now the final pieces were falling into place. The suspects, the lies, the mysteries, they were all converging on this one moment, and Whimsy knew, without a doubt, that he had them where he wanted them. The truth was out. The pieces were in place, and now all that was left was for justice to take its course. But in the stillness of the room, Whimsy couldn't shake the feeling that something more was lurking beneath the surface, a shadow waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. The case was closed, yes, but the world was still waiting for its final reckoning. As the last word left Whimsy's lips, the weight of the room seemed to shift. The silence that had enveloped them was thick with the unspoken, a silence filled with too many thoughts, too many emotions, too many things left unsaid. Miss Fenwick stood motionless, her eyes staring at the floor, unable or unwilling to meet his gaze. Richards was already fumbling for his phone, but his hands were shaking. Greaves, too, had shifted in his seat, his usual composure slipping like sand through fingers. For a long moment, Whimsy thought it was over. He had laid the truth bare. And now, it seemed, all that remained was the inevitable fallout. But then, just as he was about to take a step toward the door to make the call to the authorities himself, something shifted. A barely audible click, followed by a rustling sound, cut through the stillness. Whimsy's hand froze midair, a cold prickle of realization crawling up his spine. There was something off, something he had missed. His gaze snapped toward Clara, who had been oddly quiet through the entire confrontation. She was standing by the door, her arms still tightly crossed. But there was something else now, a hint of satisfaction in her eyes, a certain tension in her posture. She wasn't nervous anymore. In fact, she seemed almost pleased. It took a second for the thought to land. Clara hadn't been part of the equation before. She had been little more than a peripheral figure, someone who hadn't quite fit into the narrative, someone whose presence hadn't been fully accounted for. But now, as she met his gaze with an almost imperceptible smile, Whimsy realized just how wrong he had been. He had been so focused on the people who had already shown their cards that he hadn't even considered the possibility of someone who had been pulling the strings from behind the scenes, someone who had remained hidden in plain sight. Clara wasn't just a witness, a bystander to the events unfolding around her. She was a player, a mastermind in her own right. Whimsy took a slow step toward her, his eyes narrowing with sudden clarity. "You," he said quietly. Though there was no mistaking the certainty in his voice, Clara didn't flinch. Instead, she pushed herself off the wall and moved toward the center of the room, her gaze flicking to the others before settling back on Whimsy. "You're quite perceptive, aren't you, Detective?" Her voice was smooth, almost too smooth. "But you should know by now that appearances can be deceiving." Greaves' eyes widened in recognition, his mouth opening as though he wanted to speak, but no sound came out. Richards, too, seemed to be struggling to comprehend what was unfolding. "You've been quiet throughout this entire investigation," Whimsy continued, almost too quiet. "And the silence wasn't accidental, was it? You've been playing us all, leading us to believe you were harmless when in fact, you were the one pulling the strings. All along." Clara's smile deepened, a glint of something far darker in her eyes. "I had to make sure everyone was in the right place, didn't I? I knew that the best way to control a situation was to make sure all the pieces fell into place, exactly as they needed to." Whimsy could feel the pieces of the puzzle shifting once more. But this time, there was no immediate answer, no easy conclusions. For the first time in the entire investigation, doubt began to gnaw at the edge of his confidence. "Why, Clara?" he asked, his voice quieter now, but no less intense. "What was the end game? Why kill Fenwick? What was so important that you were willing to sacrifice everything for it?" Clara's gaze flickered to Miss Fenwick, and for just a moment, a flicker of something regret perhaps crossed her face before she wiped it away with a practiced indifference. "It wasn't about the murder," she said slowly, as though explaining something simple to a child. "It was about control, power. It was never just about the manuscript or Fenwick's research. It was about who would get to control it." She stepped closer to the group, her eyes scanning them all like a predator sizing up its prey. "Your uncle, Miss Fenwick, was a brilliant man, too brilliant for his own good. But the truth is, he was just a cog in the machine. The real power didn't lie in the manuscript. It lay in the knowledge, the ability to reshape minds, to manipulate perceptions, and someone had to be the one to wield it." Whimsy felt a cold chill run through him, the gravity of her words settling into his gut. The manuscript had been a tool, yes, but more than that, it was a weapon that Clara had been planning to use. And now, the truth was beginning to take on an even darker edge than he had ever anticipated. "You wanted to use it," he said quietly. "You wanted to control the very fabric of people's reality, to make them see what you wanted them to see." Clara's eyes gleamed. "Exactly. The idea wasn't just to stop Fenwick, it was to take over." She looked at each of them, her smile wide. "I knew that Fenwick wouldn't get it finished in time, but the fact that he was so close was the key. If he had succeeded, someone else might have stepped in, someone who didn't understand the importance of control. I couldn't take that chance." Her eyes locked with Whimsy's. "I was never a bystander. I was always in control. I made sure the right pieces fell into place. I made sure the journal went missing. That certain truths were hidden, that people, like you, were led down the wrong paths. Whimsy's mind was racing. It was becoming clear now. The entire investigation had been a carefully constructed game of chessboard, where Clara had moved every piece, where Miss Fenwick, Richards, and even Greaves had been nothing but pawns. And Whimsy himself, despite his genius, had been just another piece, unaware of the true mastermind sitting quietly in the background. I knew you would come for the manuscript, Clara continued, her voice a low, almost hypnotic hum. I knew you would dig and dig until you found the truth. But you never understood that the truth was never the point. The point was who could control it. And now that you've uncovered everything, it's too late. You're all part of the game now. Whimsy stood frozen for a moment, the pieces of the puzzle falling into place in an instant. He had thought the case was resolved. He had believed he had solved it. But now, in the cold light of this final revelation, he realized that the game was far more complex than he had ever imagined. Clara wasn't just the mastermind, she was the one who had orchestrated the entire web of lies, the one who had manipulated everyone to do her bidding, including him. Then what now? Whimsy asked, his voice barely above a whisper, the weight of the situation settling on him. Clara's smile deepened. Now the real game begins. As the words echoed in the room, Whimsy knew one thing for certain. The investigation was far from over. The room seemed to close in around Whimsy as Clara's words lingered, hanging like a thick fog. The air was charged with a palpable tension that set his teeth on edge. His mind raced, trying to piece together the full extent of what she had just confessed. It was all so sudden, so much darker than he had expected. Clara wasn't just a bystander, she was the puppet master, the one who had orchestrated every move, every misstep in this tangled web of deception. And now, with the case seemingly closed, the real game had only just begun. She stood there, smiling as though she had won. But Whimsy knew better. He wasn't going to let her escape. He couldn't. Not after everything he had uncovered. Not after the lives that had been ruined, the murder that had been committed in the name of control. So, Whimsy said, his voice low but steady, you were always in control. You manipulated us all, pulling the strings from the shadows. But you forgot one thing, Clara. You underestimated me. Her smile faltered for a brief moment, and for the first time, Whimsy saw the cracks in her carefully constructed facade. I didn't underestimate you, detective, she replied, her voice still smooth, but with an edge. I knew exactly who you were. I just didn't think you would catch on so quickly. But it's too late now. The game is over. Whimsy shook his head, taking a step toward her. No, Clara, the game isn't over. It's just beginning for you. I know what you've done. I know everything, and I'm going to make sure you pay for it. Her eyes narrowed, the amusement fading from her face. Do you really think you can stop me? Do you really think anyone will believe you now? You've already solved the murder, but the rest of the story, my story, remains untold. You'll never prove it. Not in time. He could feel the weight of her words, the certainty with which she spoke. But he knew something she didn't. He was never just one step behind. He had always been one step ahead. And now, as the final pieces of the puzzle clicked into place, he could see the full picture. The thing about you, Clara, Whimsy said slowly, is that you've been so caught up in controlling everything, in orchestrating this entire narrative, that you forgot to cover your tracks. You've made mistakes, small ones, but critical. Clara's eyes flickered for just a second, but she quickly masked her unease. What mistakes? Whimsy smiled, a cold, calculating smile. The first mistake you made was underestimating how well I could read people. Your little game of deception wasn't as flawless as you thought. I saw the cracks long before you decided to reveal yourself. The way you reacted when I started asking the right questions, your reluctance to speak, your insistence on standing at the back of the room. All of that was a tell, Clara. You were trying to distance yourself from the chaos, but you couldn't help but be drawn into it. Clara's hands clenched into fists, but she said nothing. She was trying to maintain her composure, to hold on to the illusion that she still had control. But Whimsy could see the subtle signs of her unraveling. The second mistake you made, he continued, was assuming that I wouldn't notice the little Inconsistencies in your story. For example, the missing journal entry. The one that was conveniently lost just before you were supposed to be looking for it. Do you remember that, Clara? I do. You hid it, and when I asked about it, your reaction was too controlled. You were too calm, too collected. It was as if you knew exactly where it was. Because you had stolen it. Clara's eyes widened slightly, and for a brief moment, Whimsy saw the cold mask slip, revealing the true depth of her guilt. But she recovered quickly, brushing off his words with a laugh. You think I took the journal to hide it? How quaint. You've never been good at understanding people, Whimsy. You've spent so much time chasing ghosts, you've missed the real truth. Whimsy ignored her taunts. The third mistake, Clara, was your misplaced trust in those around you. You thought they were too caught up in their own lives to notice yours. Greaves, Richards, even Miss Fenwick, they all had their roles to play in your game. But the moment you tried to push them too far, you made your final error. You thought you could control the narrative, but you couldn't control the people. She laughed again, but this time, it was hollow. And what? You think you've won now. You've caught me in your web of words, but you still can't prove a thing. You still have no evidence. No one will believe you. I have too much power, Whimsy. Too many connections. Even if you expose me, I'll be gone before you can blink. Whimsy's expression hardened. You're wrong, Clara. I don't need to prove anything. I already have. The final mistake you made was thinking you could manipulate me the same way. You manipulated everyone else. I didn't need to rely on evidence. I had something more powerful, intuition. And now I have something even better. Clara's face twisted in confusion as Whimsy pulled a small, leather-bound notebook from his coat pocket. This is the proof you thought you could bury. The real manuscript, the one you didn't know I found. He flipped it open, revealing a series of handwritten notes in an unmistakable handwriting. Fenwick's last entry. The one you thought you destroyed. The one you thought no one would ever find. Clara's eyes went wide, and for the first time, her composure cracked completely. She took a step forward, but Whimsy held up his hand to stop her. You see, Clara, he said, his voice steady and triumphant, I wasn't just solving a murder. I was piecing together a far bigger puzzle. And now you're caught. Your game's over. For a long moment, there was nothing but the sound of Clara's shallow breathing, the silence in the room thick and tense. Then, with a final, bitter laugh, she spoke. You think this ends with me, she said softly. You really think you've beaten me. You may have uncovered my plans, but there's always more. Always another layer. You've solved one mystery, Whimsy, but you'll never find the truth behind it all. The world will keep turning, and the game will never stop. Whimsy could only watch as she made one last, desperate move, her hand reaching for something beneath her coat. But it was too late. The authorities arrived minutes later, summoned by the same phone call Richards had made earlier. They took Clara into custody, though she went quietly, her eyes never leaving Whimsy's as she was led out of the room. The case, for all its twists and turns, was finally over. But as Whimsy watched her leave, he couldn't shake the feeling that Clara had been right about one thing. The game wasn't over. It would never be over. Justice had been served. But the shadow of the truth still loomed large, just beyond the reach of the law. And though the villain had been caught, Whimsy knew some mysteries, no matter how carefully solved, were never truly finished. The finality of the case weighed heavily on Whimsy as he left the courtroom, the sound of Clara's footsteps fading into the distance as she was escorted away. The entire affair had played out like an elaborate chess game, each move calculated and deliberate. Yet in the end, it had been Whimsy's sharp eye for the smallest detail that had secured the victory. The mystery of the manuscript, of Miss Fenwick's death, of Clara's twisted manipulation. He had solved it all. Justice had been served, and for a brief moment, he allowed himself the luxury of a deep breath, the satisfaction of a job well done. Yet, as he stepped out into the cool evening air, something tugged at the edges of his mind. It wasn't the weight of the case that lingered. It wasn't the look in Clara's eyes as she was led away, or the way Richards and Greaves had fumbled over their words when the truth finally came to light. No, it was something else, a sense of unfinished business, a question that had been raised but never fully answered. Whimsy paused at the top of the courthouse steps. Staring out at the darkening sky, the world felt still, as though holding its breath. Everything had been so neatly wrapped up, the pieces fitting together like a puzzle. The criminals exposed, the motive clear. But then, just before the final reveal, there had been something, a shadow that had passed across Clara's face. A fleeting moment of doubt that no one else seemed to notice. She had been caught, yes, but in that last instant, there had been something more, something left unsaid. His hand instinctively reached for the pocket where he'd placed the leather-bound manuscript earlier, the one Fenwick had so desperately tried to hide. He pulled it out and examined it once more, flipping through the yellowed pages that contained the professor's final notes, a mix of ideas and theories, some of them more speculative than others. There was a section near the back, something he hadn't paid much attention to before, a note that had seemed insignificant at the time, but now felt different. Wimsey stopped and reread the words, his brow furrowing. It wasn't a clue, per se, but a notation, a reference to something called the Second Project. There had been no mention of it in Clara's confession, and it hadn't come up during the investigation. In fact, it seemed like an afterthought, as though it had been scribbled down in a moment of distraction. But the more he stared at it, the more it gnawed at him. The Second Project, he muttered under his breath. What could that possibly mean? It was absurd, of course. Fenwick had been obsessed with his work on the manuscript, his experiments in controlling perception and reality. But what if there had been more? What if Fenwick's research wasn't just about the manuscript? What if there was something else, something even darker, lurking beneath the surface? Wimsey turned the page. The cryptic note on the next page was another reference to the Second Project, followed by a few hastily written lines that didn't make any immediate sense. The pattern is repeating. There's more. The first key has been found. The second must be hidden. What the devil did that mean? And why had he never noticed it before? Had Clara known about it? Was that why she had been so desperate to control the manuscript, to bury Fenwick's work? His thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps behind him. He turned, instinctively slipping the notebook back into his coat pocket as a figure approached Greaves, looking unusually anxious, his eyes darting around nervously as if he were expecting someone to jump out at him. I thought, you might still be here, Greaves said, his voice low. I wanted to thank you for everything, for solving the case. Wimsey raised an eyebrow, still half absorbed in the mystery that seemed to be resurfacing in his mind. Thank you. After everything that happened. Greaves shifted uncomfortably, clearly not expecting that response. I know it wasn't pretty, he muttered, but you did what needed to be done. The truth needed to come out. Wimsey studied him carefully, but before he could speak, Greaves took a step closer. But there's something you should know, something I didn't tell you during the investigation, something important. His voice dropped to a whisper, and Wimsey leaned in, his interest piqued. Asterisk. There was a reason Fenwick's research was so important, a reason beyond the manuscript. He was working on something else, something bigger. It's why Clara went to such extremes to stop him. Wimsey's pulse quickened. What do you mean? Greaves hesitated, clearly weighing whether or not to share this final piece of information. I don't know the full extent of it, he said finally, but there was talk, rumors, really, that Fenwick had discovered a way to manipulate memory. Not just perception, but actual memories, like rewriting them. He thought he could change history, our history, by altering how people remembered things. You see, that's why the manuscript was so dangerous. It wasn't just about controlling reality, it was about controlling people. Wimsey's mind raced, the pieces of the puzzle spinning faster than he could keep up. Memory manipulation, changing history, it was the stuff of science fiction. But then again, so had Fenwick's other work. The implications were mind-boggling. But why would Clara want to stop it? Wimsey asked, his voice thick with disbelief. If Fenwick was on the verge of something like that, why not let him finish his work? She could have controlled it, used it to her advantage. Greaves shook his head. Because she was afraid. Afraid of what it could become in the wrong hands. Fenwick had no interest in power. He wanted to understand it, to use it. But if someone like Clara had gotten control of that kind of power, no one would have been safe. Whimsy felt a cold shiver run down his spine. The implications of what Greaves had just said were staggering. If Fenwick had truly discovered something as dangerous as the ability to manipulate memory, then Clara wasn't just a murderer, she was trying to stop the rise of a power she couldn't control. And worse, it seemed that even now, the full scope of the danger hadn't been fully realized. Greaves turned to leave, but paused at the top of the stairs, looking back over his shoulder. "Be careful, Whimsy. There's more to this than you know. I'm not sure what Fenwick was really trying to do, but if you keep digging, you might find yourself in a much deeper hole than you're prepared for." Whimsy stood there, his thoughts swirling. It had been a long, hard-fought battle to uncover the truth behind the murder and the mystery of the manuscript. But now, as he looked up at the darkening sky, a new and even darker question loomed on the horizon. The case wasn't over, not by a long shot. If Fenwick's research had been even half of what Greaves suggested, then there were far more dangerous forces at play than anyone had imagined. A mystery, it seemed, never truly ends.